In this video, we begin with the Roman Empire did not rise on legions alone. It rose on the backs of individuals, men forged in discipline, sharpened by war, and immortalized by fear. But to understand what made these warriors so formidable, we must go back. Not to the battlefield, but to the beginning. To their earliest days, before the armor, before the rank, before the world would know their names, before they were feared by nations. They were boys in the shadow of Rome's vast power. Childhood in the empire was not the gentle innocence we might imagine. From an early age, Roman boys were taught two things: obedience and duty. For the sons of soldiers, this was even more intense. Discipline was the family trade. Daily life was already a preparation for the legion. Boys rose at dawn, often to the barked commands of fathers or elders. Meals were simple bread, olives, water, not indulgence but fuel. Games were not idle play, but contests of strength, wrestling, running, stone, throwing, mock sword fights with wooden sticks. Victory was praised, weakness was mocked, and the lesson was clear. Rome had no place for the soft. The state reinforced this. In every city, the ideals of virtus, courage, honor, endurance, were hammered into young minds. Statues of heroes lined the forums, their stone eyes staring down at the next generation. Stories of past victories were recited like prayers. A child grew up knowing he belonged to something greater than himself, and that one day he might be called to defend it. By their mid-teens, the path was already visible. Some would train under veterans in family compounds. Others would be enrolled in youth groups where marching, shield drills, and even mock formations were taught. A boy's worth was measured not by words, but by how long he could run, how much weight he could carry, and how hard he could strike without tiring. For the warriors we are about to meet, this was the soil in which their legend began. A relentless upbringing where weakness was weeded out long before the first real battle. At 17, the boy became a recruit. The Campus Martius, the Field of Mars in Rome, or its equivalents in the provinces, was where dreams of glory turned to sweat, bruises, and pain. The first weeks were brutal. New recruits were deliberately overburdened, marching over 20 miles a day, carrying packs heavier than themselves, boots grinding their feet raw. Wooden swords, Zell or Rhodus, were twice the weight of real ones, so that the real thing would feel almost light in combat. Shields were thick and heavy, and the young men learned to hold them up until their arms shook uncontrollably. They practiced pilum throws until their shoulders screamed, drilled in perfect unison, until 100 boots struck the ground as one. There was no room for individuality here. The legion moved as one body, and any man out of rhythm was quickly corrected, often painfully. Evenings were no rest. Armor maintenance, equipment inspection, latrine duties. The discipline was constant, the standard unyielding. Instructors, often scarred veterans, barked orders with voices that cut through exhaustion. They were not merely teaching technique. They were shaping minds that could endure hunger, fear, and the sight of blood without flinching. Here, too, reputations began to form. A recruit who showed unnatural endurance, a fearless charge in mock combat, or a keen tactical mind could find himself noticed by centurions. These were the seeds of the fearsome warriors we will name. Men whose skill was born in sweat and pain long before their names were whispered in enemy camps. Not all fear was born from sheer strength. Some of it came from the mind. Among the most feared warriors of Rome were its generals. men who could command thousands and turn the tide of entire wars with strategy alone. Take Scipio Africanus, whose calm in the face of Hannibal's terrifying elephants at Zama earned him both victory and legend. His enemies feared not just his army's might, but his ability to anticipate every move they would make. Or Germanicus, whose name sent shivers along the Rhine, a leader who inspired loyalty so fierce that soldiers would march into certain death at his word. These generals combined the soldier's discipline with a predator's cunning. They learned to use terrain, weather, and psychology as weapons. An enemy camp could be broken without a single fight, simply by forcing them to starve, freeze, or march until exhaustion destroyed their will. Stories of their victories spread like wildfire. In distant provinces, tribes would surrender at the rumor of a certain banner appearing on the horizon. Fear became its own form of combat, a weapon as sharp as the gladius, and yet, the roots of their power were the same as those of the common soldier childhood. Discipline, brutal training, and the unshakable belief that Rome must prevail, whatever the cost. Beyond the legions, disciplined walls marched men whose purpose was far more dangerous and far less visible. These were the speculators and explorators, Rome's eyes, ears, and knives in the shadows. The speculators were not parade soldiers. They did not fight in gleaming formation or carry the polished shields of the front line. Their armor was lighter, their movements faster, and their weapons, small blades, throwing darts and short spears, were made for speed and silence. Their role was infiltration, slipping into enemy camps, mapping terrain, and eliminating key figures before a battle began. Enemy commanders learned to fear them not because they saw them, but because they didn't. Entire campaigns could be undone when food stores were set ablaze in the night, or when a chief was found dead before dawn. The explorators were their counterparts in open terrain. Scouts who rode ahead of the army, gathering intelligence on enemy positions, strength, and weaknesses. They learned to read the land like a map written in the soil, broken branches revealing troop movements, fresh ash marking campfires, animal tracks disturbed by marching feet. These special forces also excelled at psychological warfare. A village might wake to find enemy sentries missing, their watch posts eerily empty. Rumors spread faster than truth, and fear took root before the legions even arrived. Training for such men was relentless. They were drilled in stealth, survival, and the use of enemy weapons to blend in if captured. Failure was not an option, and capture often meant slow death. For these men, fear was not just a weapon they carried, it was the shadow they became. Rome's enemies often assumed that every soldier in the legion was Roman-born. The truth was far more complex and far more intimidating. Alongside native citizens marched auxiliaries, warriors from the empire's farthest edges, each bringing their own style of killing to the battlefield. From Numidia came the cavalry, riders whose speed and maneuverability outmatched almost any force. They carried javelins that could pierce armor from a gallop, then vanished into the dust before an enemy could counterattack. To fight them was to fight shadows. From Syria came the archers, famed for their deadly accuracy. Even in heavy wind, they could place arrows into the weak points of armor. Enemies often advanced under a rain of death. They could neither see nor answer. Germanic warriors, tall and broad, brought the raw power of the northern tribes, wielding massive swords and axes that could cleave through both shield and man in a single blow. Their mere appearance on the field, towering over their Roman comrades, could sap an enemy's courage before the first strike. Rome valued these foreigners not only for their skill, but for the terror their unfamiliar tactics inspired. An enemy expecting Roman discipline might instead face a sudden cavalry sweep, a storm of arrows, or a berserker charge, each designed to break morale. Service as an auxiliary was both an honor and a path to citizenship, and many of these warriors served with a ferocity born from the promise of reward. But for the enemies they faced, their loyalty mattered little. Only the fear they brought remained. Rome understood that the mind was as vulnerable as the body. Winning a battle often began long before the clash of steel. Psychological warfare was an art form, and the most feared warriors knew exactly how to wield it. Marching formations were not just about discipline. They were theater. The synchronized step of thousands, the glint of sunlight on polished armor, the rhythmic pounding of shields, all announced that Rome had arrived. To an untrained force, it was like facing a wall that moved. Armor design itself was meant to intimidate. Crested helmets gave soldiers extra height. Face masks, often stylized into grim expressions, turned warriors into faceless harbingers of death. Standards and banners carried symbols that, once seen in battle, became omens of inevitable defeat. The siege was perhaps Rome's most terrifying psychological weapon. To encircle an enemy city, cut off its supplies, and wait was to turn every day into a slow surrender. Siege engines, massive towers and hurling machines, were rolled into view, even when they would not be used immediately, just to crush hope. Even the sounds of war were manipulated. Horn blasts and war drums could create chaos in enemy ranks, masking troop movements or signaling false attacks to exhaust defenders. And when all else failed, Rome used the most direct tactic of all: overwhelming force. Let the enemy see not a skirmish, but an entire legion advancing in perfect order, supported by cavalry, artillery, and auxiliaries. More than once, opponents broke and fled before steel ever touched flesh. The most feared warriors knew that victory was not always about killing the most enemies. Sometimes, it was about ensuring those enemies never dared to fight at all. To be feared was a weapon, but it was also a curse. In Rome, glory came with a shadow, and for the most feared warriors, that shadow often followed them, even into their own ranks. On the battlefield, their names inspired confidence among allies and dread among enemies. But in the politics of the empire, such fame could be dangerous. A general who won too many victories risked attracting the suspicion of the Senate or the emperor himself. Julius Caesar's assassination was the most famous example, but far from the only one. Leaders cut down not by swords, but by whispers and daggers in the dark. The physical cost was just as heavy. Even the most disciplined warriors could not escape wounds. Some carried scars from battles past, jagged lines across faces, burns from enemy fire, deep cuts in arms and legs that never fully healed. Pain became a constant companion. Then there was the cost no one could see: the roar of battle, the screams of the dying, the stench of blood. These sounds and smells lingered in the mind long after the fighting ended. What we now call trauma and post-war afflictions were understood in Rome only as weakness or melancholia. There was no compassion for the mental wounds of war. Men who could not sleep, who avoided crowds, who startled at sudden noises, were seen not as victims, but as lacking virtue. And yet, the fear they inspired was a burden they could never shed. In peacetime, a feared man was still feared, even by his neighbors. Some were honored with monuments. Others lived in isolation, unable to find peace in a society that saw them only as instruments of war. In the end, many learned the bitter truth in Rome: to be feared was to be used, until you were no longer needed. Centuries have passed since the banners of Rome flew over Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, yet the echoes of its most feared warriors remain. Their tactics, their discipline, and their legends shaped the armies that came after. Medieval knights borrowed Roman formations. Renaissance generals studied the writings of Julius Caesar and Vegetius to understand how Rome moved men like pieces on a chessboard. Even modern military academies still cite the discipline and organization that made the legions unstoppable. The fear these warriors inspired did not die with them. It was immortalized in stone reliefs, in scrolls, and in the stories told by survivors. Enemies passed down warnings about them through generations. Tales that blurred the line between history and myth. A name that once caused an army to falter could, centuries later, still carry the weight of inevitability. But the greatest legacy was not in the tactics or the victories. It was in the reminder that power is as much about perception as reality. A warrior's reputation could win a battle before the first blow, and could protect an empire as surely as its walls. For Rome's most feared, their lives were marked by triumph, sacrifice, and the knowledge that they would never be forgotten, for better or worse. Fear is a double-edged sword. For the warriors of Rome, it was their shield, their weapon, and often their undoing. They carved their names into history, not just through strength, but through the legends that spread ahead of them like wildfire. But behind the marble statues and heroic inscriptions were human beings, men who endured pain, loss, and the constant weight of expectation. They carried the glory of Rome on their shoulders and the scars of battle in their hearts. Today, their stories still inspire awe. We admire their courage, their discipline, their ability to stand unshaken in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet we should also remember the cost. The nights without sleep, the friends left on distant fields, the knowledge that in Rome, the reward for being feared was not always safety, but suspicion. And so I leave you with a question: if you had lived in their time, would you choose to be feared above all else? Or would you seek the quieter, safer path of respect?